Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. I'm very thankful to be joined today by Dr. Debbye Turner Bell, who is a veterinarian, author, journalist, corporate trainer, minister, motivational speaker, wife, and mother. I know that's a lot, and I'm anxious to get to her story. And in August 2021, she also added best-selling author to that role. And with her new book, Courageous Faith, A Lifelong Pursuit of Faith Over Fear. She's also enjoyed a long career in broadcast journalism. She has served as a lead U.S. news anchor for Arise News, a global news network from 2013 to 2016, and hosted a daily evening news broadcast called Arise America. She is currently can be seen as an expert contributor to Dogs 101 on the Animal Planet. Thank you for joining me today, Debbye.
It is my absolute pleasure, Charles. How are you today?
Doing great. You have such a fascinating story that I know I didn't do justice in unpacking. So I'd love for you to give our listeners kind of your background and your story. And then I'd love to kind of dive into different areas of it just to see how one part of it led to another.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. If you toss it to me with that open-ended, we could be here for days. But in a coconut shell, as you mentioned, I first finished my education many, many years ago as a doctor of veterinary medicine. I wanted to be a veterinarian my entire life. Love animals. We were the neighborhood humane society in my neighborhood when I was growing up because I had a mom who loved animals, and she would take in any abandoned, abused, neglected, half roadkill, anything. And we would rehabilitate them, keep them as a part of our family, or release them back out into the wild, whatever the appropriate case may be. So as I was growing up, I developed two loves, a love of animals and a love of science. And so the marriage of the two of those for me was veterinary medicine. So at a very young age, I decided I wanted to be a veterinarian. And then I set out to research what that takes. And I found out that at that time, there were only 27 veterinary schools in the entire country. There's only one or two more since then. They're very hard to get into. Veterinary education is a very vigorous one. I explain it like this. It's like being a human doctor, but a veterinarian knows the same thing a human physician knows, but knows it about 6 different species. And so I knew it was going to take a lot of hard work to get into, and it is expensive. And I was growing up in a single parent, lower middle class home, and my family couldn't afford the education that I wanted. And the whole reason I told all of that part of the story was that set me on a course toward the Miss America pageant. And I won't tell that whole long story, but I got involved in pageants because I found out that the Miss America scholarship program was the largest source of scholarship for women in the world. And that if I won a state pageant, made it to the national pageant, I could win tens of thousands of dollars in scholarship money. And I said, I'll do it. Where do I sign up? All because I wanted to pay for my veterinary education. And I did. It was a 7-year journey. It took 7 years, 11 tries in 2 different states. I finally won a state pageant and went on to the Miss America pageant, and it worked out pretty well for me. I became Miss America in 1990, 500 years ago. And that changed my life. And I bring that up because it really set into place some important things that put me on a trajectory toward what I do now in workshop facilitation, in leadership development training. I started off doing motivational speaking, and that developed and evolved and grew even while I had a 25-year career in broadcast news. So that's it in a coconut shell.
Great story, Debbye. I love to kind of unpack a little bit more of the Miss America. I'm always curious on pieces of experts' backgrounds that really led them to success. So if you could, are there any factors that you can identify now that were really crucial for your success in the role that you currently have now and in the Miss America pageantry? Is it, because I know they do a lot of great work. There's a lot of great skills that they embody, but are there one or two that you notice now to say, this was really instrumental in me becoming this type of person today?
Absolutely. I think one of the keys to success in life is to be a strong communicator, no matter what the industry, no matter what the chosen career field, that you can be a genius and have, profound world changing thoughts. But if you cannot communicate those in an effective way, in many ways, you won't be any more successful than someone who has no training, no education. So communication is so important. And that became apparent in my young life, but certainly as Miss America and even competing in the pageant. Many people lump all pageants into one pot, but they're not all the same. Miss America is different in that we're a scholarship organization. That's what the women win. They don't win modeling contracts and, an agent in a Hollywood career. They win scholarship dollars to go toward their education. But part of the competition is a private job style interview. And even having worked in broadcast news for 25 years, I can say that interview at the Miss America pageant or in the Miss America system is the most rigorous, the most tough interview I've ever gone through. And so learning how to communicate thoughts and ideas and opinions in a way that were understandable and palatable and even appealing was absolutely necessary in order to successfully compete in the Miss America system. I was told along the way that the Miss America pageant is won in the interview and lost on stage. And so even the young ladies who had great talent, which is another big part of the competition, if they weren't strong communicators, they weren't going to win. And so even back in my pageant days, I learned how important it was to hone my communication skills. And then being Miss America meant it was built on a foundation of strong communication, being able to go into a room and make connections with people and find those common denominators and build influence on the fly in real time. And at that time, as a young woman, and so, I was at a disadvantage sometimes because some people have negative stereotypes about a pageant winner. Even though at that time I was on my way to becoming a doctor, I was still a young 20 something with a crown on my head. And so being able to gain credibility in a few seconds to build influence in a conversation was something I had to learn. And so I've taken all of that, the mistakes that I made, the experiences I lived through, and I poured that into leadership development training in communications, because I really learned in real time, in the field, on the street, if you will, how to be a strong communicator. And then, of course, that was magnified 1,000 times when I got into broadcast news.
And that's great. That sounds like that transition really helped you get into broadcast journalism and broadcast news and have a very storied career there as well. And I've attended lots of your leadership programs virtually over the past few years, and I love how you break down powerful communication. And one of the first things you always lead off is reminding everyone that powerful communication builds a connection. That's its purpose. And
Yeah.
building rapport is key to making that connection, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. This is what I love to say, that a good rapport covers a multitude of fault, which is a riff on, actually, it's a scripture that says love covers a multitude of fault. But when we learn how to build rapport and build connection with people, we don't have the perfect words. It doesn't have to be delivered in, an eloquent way. When we have connection with people, it can provide the bridge for us to strong communication and greater influence. And really, that's what communication is all about. It's about building a sphere of influence so that you can get to where you want to go in your career or in your life, or get what you need to have, or change minds and affect change in the way that you want to do it. And very often, I see people make the mistake of skipping over that step of building rapport. They want to get right to the nut, right to the steak, if you will, and pass by the sizzle. But it is important to take that time to build connection, because when we build connection, we also build trust, we build credibility, we build buy-in. There are a number of different spheres of power, if you will. There's structural power, where you have power simply because of the position that you hold in your family and the company that you work in, or even that you lead. But then there is that influential power, which is based on relationship, or it's also called social power. And that is rooted in building rapport with people. And so I love to talk about there's a myriad of ways to build rapport, but There are 8 that are my favorite that I run through, and you don't have to do all of them all the time, but it is important to take that step, because especially when we have a message that's difficult to take, or there might be high stakes, or there might be pushback, when you take the time to build rapport, you're more likely, much more likely to achieve your goal, to achieve that influence than if you don't achieve rapport. I love to tell a story that Lisa Nirel, I don't know her, but she wrote an article in a business magazine, and she talked about this high stakes meeting that she was in where she had to deliver bad news to very high level executives at a Fortune 10 company in the United States. And she didn't take the time to build rapport, and she lost the account. And so, whereas sometimes we think we don't have time to build rapport, I submit that you can't afford not to, especially if you're trying to gain influence.
Very true. Completely agree with you. Love those 8 strategies. We won't have time to unpack them all. Love to talk about one or two of them that I believe some people often just pass over or don't think of as rapport building. And one of those is body language and matching your body language to the other person. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I like to call this the quick and dirty way to build rapport when you don't have time to do a lot of homework, you don't have a long history with the person or people with whom you are communicating. It's a way to begin to build inroads toward connection when you don't have the luxury of time. And matching body language is exactly what it sounds like. Body language is the vernacular, the common term for nonverbal cues. So that's everything that we say that has nothing to do with the words that we use. So it's the inflection in our voice, and the rate of our speech, and the expression on our face, and the position of our body, and the way we use our hands. And all of these things are ways that we can build connection with people. So making eye contact is a really effective way to begin to build rapport. When you're looking all over the room, or you're looking down at your phone, or you're picking your nails, or God forbid, doing something offensive like that, you're not going to build rapport, and therefore not going to have connection. And also reflecting the temperament and the attitude, if you will, of the person with whom you're communicating. So if they're standing, you stand. If they're sitting, you sit. Make sure your shoulders are square with theirs, faced toward them, and not halfway turned in another direction, because that subconsciously sends the message, I want to be somewhere else. So we face them straight on, shoulders erect and straight on, making eye contact, having an appropriate expression on our face. So if there is something that we are communicating passion about, that should be reflected in our facial expression. Or with our audience, if they're passionate about it, we don't have to mimic them or reproduce what they're doing. That's disingenuous, but we can acknowledge their passion that they express through their body language by, if you said something to me with high eyebrows and big eyes and a big smile, that means you're excited about something. I don't have to feign excitement in order to build rapport with you, but what I can say is, wow, Charles, I see you're really excited about this. Tell me more about that. That's a quick and easy way to begin to build rapport. And that's what I mean by matching body language.
That's great. And I've noticed too that you can tell a conversation how it's going by the individuals mirroring each other when they're having that conversation. If one leans forward and the other one does, good sign. If one leans forward and the other one stays back, maybe not so much of a good sign. And you're right, you have to be careful in how much you consciously do that. I have found that it almost happens unconsciously when you're connecting with that individual, that you just, without even noticing, you start doing things that are similar, whether they're crossing their arms, leaning toward each other. So that's some great insight into that, to really note that when building rapport. You also mentioned there's roles that nonverbal communication can play, which I think is important for our listeners to hear, because they say, yeah, I know it's important. But really, what are those kind of roles that it plays for us to get more information about the other person? And you mentioned 5. I'll quickly go through those, and maybe you can comment on one or two. One is repetition. They're just repeating it verbally. Contradiction can be expressed through body language.
Yes.
Complimenting, accenting, and substitution. So I didn't know if there was one that you have found to be more common than the others that you would like our listeners just to have more information about.
The first one that I would go straight to is that as an effective communicator, I call us powerful communicators. As a powerful communicator, what we want to make sure is that our nonverbals, our body language always matches the message that we intend to send. And so that would be complimenting. So if we are excited about something, then our nonverbals should match that. There should be open expression of the face. We should appropriately use hand gestures. It should be reflected in our vocal elements. Maybe we would speak a little louder, maybe would speak a little faster, maybe the register would go up just a little bit because we're excited about it. And if this is something that matches what we're communicating, then being intentional about using our body language is a way to compliment. And I want to just mention that you're absolutely right, that most people use body language subconsciously. They don't even realize that they're doing it. I submit to you, though, that an effective or a powerful communicator is intentional about using their body language to complement and match what they're saying. One of the examples I love to give is, Charles, if you gave a report and I said to you, good job on that report. When I say it that way, my body language, my vocal inflection hopefully matches the words, and you would believe that I thought you did a good job on that report. However, if I use the very same words, but do it this way and say, good job on that report, how do I feel? Do I really think you did a good job? You don't know. At the very least, you confuse people because the body language, the vocal inflection didn't match the words. And as strong communicators, we can be intentional about making sure our own nonverbals, our own body language matches the message that we mean to send with the words that we're using to send that message. That's what's called complimenting. And it's almost like underlining if you were writing out a message. It's the same effect of underlining or italicizing or bolding a word. Our nonverbals can do the same thing in a verbal message.
And there's so much communication that's nonverbal that you can get so much more out of that conversation. I recently had a conversation with someone and they said, I agree with this. And they were shaking their head in disagreement. So
Yep.
contradictory nonverbal cues, right? That you wanted to at least question or unpack. And that's so important. It's easy to do. It's harder, I think, to become more mindful of doing it on a regular basis because you catch yourself at different times saying, oh, I didn't even realize I was doing that. So by practicing it, by having maybe a coach, accountability partner, that sometimes helps as well so that everything's in alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. And back in the olden days when we did in-person all day sessions, there was an opportunity for people to practice a message so that they could get that feedback. And so you're absolutely right. Having, whether it's a mentor or just a good friend or your partner in life, say, hey, can I run this message past you? Tell me what you think. Give me feedback, not only on what you hear, but what you see. That's a good way to get that feedback from someone else because we can't see ourselves the way other people see us. So having that feedback is absolutely critical and crucial. But you lead me to a point that I think is important because we do now live in this era of virtual communication. And while, we are going back to doing more things in person, I think virtual communication is a part of our business world in perpetuity. And you can use nonverbals to your advantage, even in a virtual communication. You can pay attention to people's gestures and inflection. And just like you said, with that person who was shaking their head no, even though they were saying yes. As a strong communicator, you could say, you know what, it looks like you might have some hesitation. Let's unpack that. Let's talk about that. That's another way to build connection because people then really feel heard. You've not just heard the words they've said, you've heard the emotion that they've expressed. And that can go a long way also toward building connection.
Love that. Love how that's so impactful. And I think many leaders still need to hear that. Is there one other area of building rapport that you wanted to touch upon? I know you go over quite a few and we aren't going to have time to unpack them all. If not, I can throw out one that I like, but love to hear what you think would be another important piece of it
Yeah.
for people listening.
Absolutely. Actually, there are two, and I'll do them quickly. First of all, good, strong communication is really always about what I call your audience. That audience can be one person or a group or an actual group of people like an audience, but it's more about them than it is about you. And so that's where building that connection comes in. Building a connection is about your audience. It's really not about you. So, as a strong communicator and as a good influential leader, we must keep our audience in mind. What's important to them? What are they thinking of? What message are they receiving? And no matter the message that we intend to convey, but there is the difference between intent and impact. And you can have good intentions all day long, but if the impact is different, then you're not going to achieve your goals. And so we have to make sure that our impact is aligned with our intent, and keeping our audience in mind is absolutely important for that. The other quick thing is, for a strong communicator, you have to be an equally strong listener. There's just no good communication without it. I see so many people, working so hard to make sure they choose the right words, and even to have the great inflections and the good vocal character and the good facial expressions and the good delivery and all of that. But they're terrible, lousy listeners. And we have to learn how to be really good active listeners, which is hard. It takes intention over time to learn to be a good listener, but that's an equally important component of strong communication.
I agree with you completely. I would argue that that would even be half of a good, strong, effective communicator is being
Yeah.
able to listen. If they're only wanting to get their point across and waiting for their time to talk, which I've seen from plenty of leaders where they're really not listening to you, they're pseudo listening. They're just
Mhm.
waiting for an opportunity to tell you what they want to tell you. And if you notice that through their nonverbals, in some cases, I've just stopped since I know that it's not being effective or connecting, and saying, okay, what would you like to say? Because it sounds like you're really anxious to say something, right? So let's talk about listening and active listening and really what that entails. Since people say, yes, I want to be a good communicator, but many times they don't have the tips to really say, okay, what does that really mean to be an active communicator or listener so that you're understanding and they feel understood?
Yeah, absolutely. So active listening is bringing your whole self to listening. It is not just being quiet, although you do have to stop talking in order to listen. A lot of people think that they can multitask and they can do a number of things at one time, but our brain literally was not built that way. And so what we do is we switch back and forth. Active listening, you got to stop talking on the outside and stop talking in your head so that you can really listen. Active listening also means reserving judgment, reserving stereotype, reserving presumption, and truly listening to what's being said. It also includes what I would call empathetic listening, and that's listening for the emotions in addition to the words. Going back to the example that I used to you just a few minutes ago, where I can say the words, good job on that report. But if my emotions say something different, where I say, good job on that report, then automatically there's a whole nother message in there that the person is not saying. And so, as a listener, when you can pick up on those underlying emotions, then you build all types of credit and connection with your audience and say, I see your hesitation. Tell me where that comes from. Or I see you're willing to go a different way, but it looks like you're excited about this avenue. Tell me more about why this avenue seems right to you. And man, that will take you so many places you wouldn't even imagine, because people feel heard. And the statistics show that when we are active, comprehensive listeners, when people feel heard, it increases credibility with them, it increases trust, it does increase influence, and it also it increases the tendency to give the benefit of the doubt. So if you are a great listener and you're really hearing the emotion of what someone is saying, in addition to the words, in addition to the message that's being communicated through their nonverbals, even making a faux pas in what you say can be recovered from because of the credit you get from being an active listener. I'll say this other thing and then I'll stop and let you ask a follow-up question. And that is, if we have difficulty listening, what I highly recommend is take notes, especially for those of us whose minds go 1,000 miles a minute. And we're kind of like the Labrador that sees the squirrel in our listening habits, where we'll be listening and all of a sudden, what am I having for dinner? And listening a little bit. Oh my goodness, I can't believe they're wearing that. So when we begin to take notes, it employs a whole different part of the brain, forces us to focus in on that conversation. So we really have to bring our whole self to being an active listener and removing distractions.
And then it's important to know that it builds trust, it builds credibility, it builds influence. I had another
Absolutely.
guest of the podcast that stated, which is common sense, but everyone's favorite topic or subject to talk about is usually themselves. And
Yes,
instead of trying to be someone that they find interesting, you should be interested in them. I've had many
absolutely.
conversations in the past where I think I maybe offered minimal, if any, information or comments. I just kept asking questions after it. A couple times I've heard, wow, they thought you were so interesting. It went so great. And I'm thinking to myself, I really didn't convey anything about me to them. I was just fascinated by their story, and they found that fascinating and interesting.
Yep. There's a saying that says people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And you can demonstrate that by truly listening, actively listening.
Some of the things that I've noticed that worked well that I've gleaned from other experts is that backtrack, clarify, summarize approach of active listening. So you're nodding along or you're saying something verbally for them to know, good eye contact, that's a given. But you're also trying to backtrack, summarize what they state so they feel like they're heard, clarifying anything that you don't understand, and then asking for, is there anything that's missing? Or, I notice, I feel like something's just, not right, or based on the tone of their voice. Any tips, strategies, tools that you can give our listeners in regards to that? Is that a good approach? Is there something that I missed along that process to make it more just stepwise? Here's what they would do to make sure they're covering the bases.
No, I think those are very legitimate. I use slightly different words, but they accomplish the very same thing. The point is, though, with all of those, and I usually, call it, feedback, paraphrasing, summarizing, but that communicates that you are listening. It's not enough to listen. Your audience has to know you're listening. And this is one of the ways that you could communicate that you're listening, just like with the eye contact. That's a way of communicating. I'm listening to you. The nodding of the head, the saying, oh yeah, wow. Those are all ways to give those cues. I'm really listening to you. And then the tools that you just mentioned, whether it's backtracking or summarizing or clarifying or giving feedback, those are ways to communicate. I'm listening to you. And it's things like, so in summary, what I think I hear you saying is, and you summarize it, or to make sure I'm clear, when you say soon, do you mean next week or do you mean next month? That's a way of clarifying, but all of those send the message, I'm listening to you. I not only am I listening to you, I'm invested and I care about what you're saying enough in order to respond, in order to summarize, in order to clarify, or even codify. So our next step should be, those are excellent ways to communicate that you're listening. You can't just listen. Your audience has got to know you're listening. And those are some good ways to do it.
Great advice. And it's always something I think leaders need to hear, because pseudo listening is so predominant in this culture where we're overwhelmed, overworked, stressed out, trying to multitask on everything. I love how you stated empathetic listening. Listen for the tone, the emotions that are conveyed as well, not just the words, because that brings insights into that conversation and that person's perspective possibly as well.
Yeah. There's some statistics that I love to cite, and I won't go through the whole thing now, but suffice it to say that the words that we use when we communicates only 7% of the message that's received. So that means 93% of what our audience receives from us has nothing to do with the words that we say. And so then turn that inversely as a listener. It's not enough to just listen to the words, because there's a much larger picture being communicated through those nonverbals, through gestures, through the emotion, through vocal qualities like inflection and the rate of speech and the volume of speech, and even proximity. Is a person leaning forward, or are they sitting back disconnected? All of those things you must be actively engaged, actively listening to pick up.
Great stuff. So we've spoken about how to build rapport, to form that connection, to be a strong communicator, powerful communicator. Listening, another critical aspect of being a powerful communicator. Now for the final, part of the podcast or this episode, I'd love to kind of talk more about that emotional connection of your message. how can you use those words to really connect stronger with whoever you're communicating with, whether it's a speech, whether it's just someone at home, professionally? Because one of those key principles, which you really kind of elaborate on in your workshops and you do a great job with, is storytelling. So, love for you to give us some tips, best practices that you found to be effective in storytelling and why that's so much more effective than just spouting those facts and figures.
Yeah, you know what? Storytelling, I think, is the single most effective tool that one can use to convey a message. And it doesn't have to be a long story like, your great Uncle Sal used to tell at Thanksgiving. It can be a quick little anecdote, even when giving data and statistics or communicating policy. If you can build it around a story that's relevant, not just relevant to your message, but relevant to the listener, to the audience. Statistics show, Dr. Jennifer Aker of Stanford University found that telling a story when conveying a message was 22 times more effective in conveying that message than not telling a story, no matter how important the message was. And so that is a device that I think is vastly underutilized or perhaps not utilized to its greatest effect. Now, it is important. I'll repeat it because it's important. The story must be relevant to your message, but more importantly, it must be relevant to the listener. And so we have to be really discriminate in picking the right story. And it doesn't have to be a story about us. You don't have to tell a personal story. It could be a story about a historical figure. Or it could be, a story about a fictional figure. I remember I gave a speech one time and I made up a story about a farmer in Africa named Sesame because the story made my point. And people came up to me and they had more to say about Sesame than they did about my speech, which was a made up story, but it got the point. It drove the point home. So storytelling is a really effective technique in driving home your message, getting your point across. The one or two other really important devices is, first of all, start with what's important to your audience. Going back to that statement, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Start with what they care about, no matter what your message is. If you start with what is important to the audience, you hook them in, and then you can pull them along to whatever your goal or whatever your motive is in that message. But start with what's important to them. And then finally, there's Dr. Herman Ebbinghaus did some research about how we listen in meetings. And I'll describe the graph that was created from the results of his study. And that is, when we are listening at the very beginning of a conversation or very beginning of a meeting, our attention is at its highest. And then in 7 seconds, it drops off. And we begin to go into what's called secondary dialogue, where we begin to get in our head, we think about what we think, we get distracted by what's happening around us. And then when the person knows that the conversation or the meeting is about to end, for whatever reason, and I haven't found studies that explain this, our attention ramps up again. So we can use that information to our advantage in that start with what's going to hook them at the very beginning, because that's when people are listening the most intently. And you got to be fast at hooking them. You got 7 seconds to hook somebody in a message. And that will keep that dip of fainting away or, being distracted from going so low. And then end with what I call the big finish. There's more research that shows, and it's difficult to say when you can't see it, but I'm going to try. People remember the first thing you say most accurately, but they remember the last thing you say most recently. So, for instance, if I were to give you a list of fruit, let's just say apples, oranges, bananas, papaya, and then I ask people to repeat that list, they would most accurately remember apples and oranges because those were the first things I said. However, most people, when they repeat the list, will start with papaya because that's the last thing they heard. So you want to leave them with something that you want them to remember right away, because that's what's the last thing that they will hear. So using that, I call it headline, introduction, main points, and big finish arc, if you will, in conveying a message will help people remember more and act more precisely on what you're saying. I hope that made sense.
It did, from brain science, those recency and latency effects. People always remember what you state first and last, and it's that middle that really gets them. And those stories are so important to have throughout your program, your presentation, your speech, your dialogue, just to get that point across and illustrate it more effectively. I'd love for you to give us some insight into how you get your stories. I know that you just stated that one of them you make up, but if you're going to go into a speech or you're going to have a story as part of your program, I assume that you have maybe 3 to 4 to 5 stories. I hear that a lot from leaders. You don't need a whole lot, but you need a couple really developed ones that can be used in a myriad of situations. So if you could give our readers some insight into your process and how you structure those.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I really love it. First of all, I'm a fairly open person when it comes to especially public communication. I probably overshare, tell too many of my own personal details. That's a part of who I am, and not everybody's comfortable with that. However, if we learn to become more authentic and more transparent in sharing our life experiences, we all have diamond mines of stories to tell, especially those where there was a lesson that was learned. And those are the stories that you want to tell, where the lesson was learned to your benefit. So I, actively mine my own experiences, my own history. My poor husband and daughter just know that I'm going to tell stories that include them because I use them all the time to make points. So that's one thing, is to be as transparent and authentic as possible when looking for stories. Next is, I think every great leader should be a great reader. Every great communicator should be a great reader. And so I'm a pretty avid reader, and I keep notes. If I read someone's book or their own story or some anecdote in a newspaper article, I send myself an email and I keep a file. So when I'm preparing a presentation or a workshop or a sermon, then I consult those files and I actively keep up with those just as I live life. And that way I can go back to it and refer to it later. I never trust my memory. They're like, oh, yeah, I got to remember to use that anecdote the next time I make this point. I always document it. And then I go back to the database that I built and I pick the one that seems to fit not only the message, but the audience, most importantly.
Love that. And I do the same thing. I'm a collector of different pieces and making sure that I have those ready, because you're right. Your memory is not that reliable and you tend to forget a lot, which people don't realize.
Yeah.
You had mentioned Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve that states, and if you don't review within the first 48 hours of something that you've read or heard, you're going to forget close to 80% of it.
That's
So
right.
it's so critical to write that down, to collect it somewhere so you can use it later on, because there's a lot of wisdom and insights that probably escape your memory that you could use to make you a more powerful communicator.
Absolutely. I'll interject in there also, when you're preparing, whether it's a presentation or even for a conversation, intentionally ask yourself, have I experienced something? Has someone else I know of experienced something that helps make this point? Sometimes we as communicators don't go looking for the stories. We know what our message is and we fine tune and wordsmith that message and then deliver it. But take the time to really take an assessment. What story can I tell that will make this point? And even I believe we should all have what I call a village, whether it's that the circle of mentors or advisors or your partner at home, whatever, man, I want to make this point. Can you think of a story, that we've been through that might help? Employ some help. And they'll say, oh, yeah, remember that time you did so and so? And you're like, oh, yeah. So, understanding that we really don't have to live this life alone. We're not built to do it. So use your village. If you don't have a village, create that village to help you with things like that.
I would add too that I've seen one mistake that some leaders make is that when they do these stories, and this is kind of goes back to rapport building, because this is one of the things he lists, you need to be authentic to your true self. So that if
Yeah.
you're not a humorous person, don't try to add humor just for the sake of adding it. If
Yeah.
it's not something you're comfortable in telling or doesn't really fit who you are, it's going to come across as disingenuous and not something that really connects with the audience. Regardless if the audience would feel it or not, they can sense that if you're trying to be someone that you're not through your storytelling.
Absolutely. And you've taken a page even out of the session that I do for IMS. If you're not funny, don't try to be funny. And there's no shame in it. Not everybody is. If you're not sure if a story is funny, then, try it out on the people who have your best intention at heart, but tell you the truth. So, don't try it out on your favorite Aunt Sally who thinks everything you do is fantastic. Try it out on the truth tellers that have your best intention at heart. And if it doesn't pass their muster, then just don't use it. You're far more likely to be successful by being authentic, and not to sound schmaltzy about it, but truly what comes from the heart touches the heart. And there are speakers out there are thought leaders out there that truly change lives and never crack one joke. So you don't have to be funny. But if you can use that device of humor, it's a really effective one. But you really got to know you're good at it before you even try it out. Because, we spent a lot of time talking about building connection through building rapport. A really fast way to break connection and to break rapport is to miss the mark with humor.
I agree with you. Before we end, just real quick, wanted to touch a little bit on feedback as you're communicating and trying to improve your skill set, especially if you're higher up in the organization. Sometimes it's a challenge to get that feedback from individuals, like you said, honest feedback, especially, which is going to help you, right? It's going to be not necessarily just kudos, you did a great job, but here are the areas in which I think you can improve. One technique that I found to be helpful is not calling it feedback, but calling it advice and being specific with that advice so that they don't feel like they're going down that path of giving you feedback that you may not want to hear and they may put you at odds with them. Any tips that you might have to help our listeners kind of build that feedback muscle to become more powerful communicators?
Absolutely. And I love your technique. And I have one that's very similar. Instead of asking, okay, so give me your criticism, what did I do wrong? Position it, reframe it, and say, the next time I do this, what else should I do? Or what should I do differently? You put it in the affirmative, put it in the positive, and often that makes people more comfortable in giving you, real honest feedback as opposed to criticism. And there's a difference between those two. Another thing that I do, Charles, and this takes a step or two and you need a little time, but I find it really effective. We all have access to software or websites like SurveyMonkey. You can have a free account there. Build a form, a survey form, and allow people to fill it out anonymously. And they might think 100 people are answering the survey, and maybe you've only sent it out to 2 or 3. That doesn't really matter, but allow them to do it anonymously. And that usually gets you more to that unvarnished truth than sometimes sitting and looking somebody in the eye. I'll say this too, to that point, there are people that are uncomfortable no matter how you frame it. Tell me what I could do better next time, or if it were you, what would you have done? So you take it away from you, you put it on them, and they can say, oh, well, I wouldn't have done this, I wouldn't have done that. There are some people that are just uncomfortable looking you in the eye, giving you feedback. So for those people, but you value their opinions, don't necessarily have coffee with them. Make it a phone call, make it an email. Take away some of those aspects that can make people uncomfortable so you get closer to what they really think and how you really feel.
I love that. Make it easier for them to get that great feedback that you need to improve and to be a more effective leader, more powerful communicator. Well, we've covered
Excellent.
lots of concepts on 3 main areas on being a powerful communicator, all of them great with filled with lots of actionable tips, tools, and strategies that I think our listeners are going to benefit from. As we end each episode, I always like to ask one final question to the guest is when you first started out in your career, what is something that you know now that you wish you knew back then that would have made you a more powerful communicator or just made you more successful? And if you can illustrate it through a story, even better. But I'd love to give our listeners kind of that lesson that, if they're starting their career right now, how to avoid some of those pitfalls or obstacles that were in your path that you were unaware of.
Oh gosh, we could do a whole podcast just on that topic. Oh, why do you say that for last? Okay, so yes, a really quick one. Something that I wish I'd known my young 20-something self, early in my career self, had known was really the value of relationship building. Even with people that I was never going to go on a vacation with or necessarily invite them into my home, but how important it is to build relationship with everyone that's in your orbit. And the story that I have to tell about that was when I first started at CBS News, I was hired to be a feature reporter. And I was supposed to pitch, these fun, lighthearted stories to make it on the air. And I had a senior producer who would either approve or deny the story. And I kept pitching. I was pitching prolifically and getting denial after denial. I would say maybe 1 out of every 10 stories I pitched got accepted. But I noticed that some of the other reporters were pitching stories that weren't necessarily as sound or relevant or, in my opinion, as good as my story. And I couldn't figure out, why did they get their stories approved and mine got denied? And then I realized that throughout the day, some of the reporters who were on the air all the time spent a lot of time with their senior producers. When I walked by, they were in their office. And sometimes they're just shooting the breeze, talking about what they're going to do that weekend. And I remember feeling so superior about, oh, what a waste of time. They're not doing their work. Well, come to find out, they were doing their work. This was how they got their work done. And I finally learned that relationship building was a key part of the success of my career. And so when I stopped being in my office all day long, sending emails, from my desk, and actually went out, I called it going on parade. Or I would go out and, I'd take a little path around the floor and stop at key people's offices or desks or cubes and start conversations. Some of them were consequential conversations, some not, but I started building relationship. Or let's go back to the word we started with, rapport. Then more of my stories got on the air. So it took me a while to learn that, but once I learned it, man, I got it, and it made a big difference.
I love that. And that's a great way to wrap up everything. It starts with connection. It starts with building rapport, and it should be something that you're doing every day and continue to do throughout your career. Thank you so much, Debbie, for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you.
Oh, you can find me everywhere. I'm on all the social media platforms. I'm at Dr. Debbie on Twitter. I'm Debbye Turner Bell on Instagram. On Facebook, it's facebook.com/DebbieTB. Or you can find me on my website, which is also where you can get my book, Courageous Faith. And that's Debbye Turner Bell. Spell it the way I spell it, DebbyeTurnerbell.com, DebbyeTurnerBell.com.
Thank you, Debbie, so much. And this concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify. It can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And remember, until next time, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.